There's several stories I do want to catch up with you on, and they're all Russia-Ukraine related, it seems. The pipeline, the annexing, the mass exodus, I mean, the economy and all of those things. Let's start with the pipeline. This was kind of a spooky little deal that came up this past week, seeing these two pipelines coming out of Russia, privately held Russian gas pipelines. Neither one delivering product to customers, it would seem. One was in maintenance mode, and the other one was just never finalized. And yet we're seeing four what looks like explosions happening, and now they're leaking methane into the atmosphere at a pretty alarming rate. Sabotage, I think everybody agrees that sabotage at this point. What do you make of it all of this?
Yeah, I think it's an attempt by the Russians under the orders of Putin to change the calculus on the battlefield. And it's a point of no return. Both of those pipelines serve as an economic link between Russia and their supply of natural gas to Western Europe. And this is a communication, an attempt by the Russians to get the attention of Western Europe and saying, look, back off. But even if the war ends tomorrow, and everybody goes back to garrison, this is a long-term consequence. There's not any easy, quick way to repair those pipes and to get the gas flowing again. So it's not a question of Russia playing with a rheostat and cranking the gas down. This is a commitment and a breakaway. So that's what he means to communicate to Europe, but I don't think he's going to get what he wants.
So you're firmly in the camp that Russia is behind that. I mean, there are a lot of people who say it's the opposite. I mean, there are Western governments who are behind this, but you think it's firmly Russia who is to blame for that.
I think you look at who most immediately stands to benefit in the calculus of the battlefield. It's definitely them. I don't subscribe to the conspiracy theory that the U.S. did this. It doesn't make any sense. We don't stand to gain from it.
I was just thinking about when the pipelines we're looking at the footage of all this gas coming up. I was immediately reminded of the oil leaks in the Gulf and how difficult. We have a friend who was basically one of the main players in trying to repair that damage and mitigate the risks to the environment during that time, and how difficult that was, how much of an engineering challenge that was. Are these Russian companies actively trying to repair these lines right now?
Not that I'm aware of. Everybody's just trying to get their arms around the magnitude and scope of the problem. There is a difference between coming up with creative engineering solutions to, number one, detonate an explosion above a fire on an oil well and then cap it, which, capping a loose oil well is something we do have experience with, and then trying to repair a pipeline that's subsurface. I mean, they're deep enough that it has to be a state actor who did this, someone with submarines. And so it's going to have to be someone who's similarly equipped to deal with the breaches. And the fact that it was broken in 4 separate locations means this isn't an accident. And that we have seismic evidence that there were explosions prior to the breach means that this was a sabotage, clearly.
Mr. Dooley, I guess I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around the calculus here, as you mentioned. What would you say would be the biggest advantage for Russia in harming their own infrastructure? Are they trying to send a message? Are they escalating the war? I would imagine, for example, if it was determined that it was Russia that created this sabotage here, that would escalate the war in a sense with not only with Ukraine but everybody else who depends on that pipeline, right? Or is that the plan, do you think, or is there another benefit that we're not seeing?
Well, it's definitely a poke at NATO. Most of the EU countries who were victimized by this incident are NATO members, and so it's an attempt to get the attention of NATO, who Putin's not very happy with, for supplying advanced weaponry. Mm-hmm. The second thing is, just before winter, it communicates a very strong message to those who rely off of gas for heat.
Yes.
That we're going to take that away from you, and you're going to have to figure out how not to freeze to death this winter. It's more than just energy that drives an economy. It's keeping your house warm, and that's who this is aimed at, I think.
It's such an interesting debate to see. There was several clips, I think, being played on Talking Head cable news this week about Biden and others actually before months ago threatening to do something, stop some way, somehow the pipelines as a result of this conflict. So many are pointing to that today to say, well, there's good evidence here to suggest the West is. But again, like you said a minute ago, you don't subscribe to that. You think that the West wouldn't have done that.
No, I think the motivation was, and this is in the previous administration, warning, President Trump warning Angela Merkel, look, you guys are too dependent on Russian energy. The Nord Stream pipelines essentially put you at risk of having everything coming for natural gas into two easy pipelines that are easy for them to choke off. It was a warning. You are far too dependent, far too entangled with an unstable actor who's going to use it as leverage against you. And that's exactly what we're seeing. So this is the coming to fruition of our warning. We were afraid this would happen, and now here we are.
Matt, we have about 2 minutes before we got to go to break, but I was seeing this tweet that was getting just a little bit of traction. It was saying, I hadn't even heard of that pipeline until the USA blew it up. And I was like, okay, you got two things going on there. One, you're assuming the USA blew it up. And the second thing is that a lot of people, it seems, are reacting to this, but then they're like realizing, wait, I didn't even know this was a thing. So what exactly is the pipeline that is happening? What's the significance of it?
You've got two pipelines, Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. 2 wasn't finished. Number 1 was the main pipeline that goes through the North Sea. So you're talking about from northern Russia into Western Europe, and from which is supplied most of the natural gas that goes to Western Europe. You can get it from other sources, including the U.S., but it's the main line that goes underneath the North Sea. And
one of the big stories that we've learned yesterday, in fact, because there were some referendums in the Donbos region of Ukraine, one of the hotly contested portion of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, is that Russia is going to be annexing those today. So what's the story here, Matt Dooley?
That's a cynical attempt by Vladimir Putin to throw a blanket of coverage over territory that his army has seized. The reason why it's strategically significant, all else being equal, is that once he annexes those territories, he can declare that as officially Russia, which changes the rules of engagement for what technically and legally he's allowed to do to protect Russia. So in theory, if that territory is allowed to be Russian or seen as Russian, then an attack on that puts nuclear weapons in play. An attack on that puts his ability to raise additional forces because Russia, quote unquote, Mother Russia, is being attacked. Realistically, though, everyone in the world outside the boundaries of Russia proper sees this for what it is. It's not his territory. It doesn't belong to Russia. Just because you're fighting over it, just because you stepped over the border and put Russian troops on that soil and gathered a few ethnic Russians around you to support you, doesn't mean that land belongs to you. You can't walk into your neighbor's house, sit in his living room, and declare that a part of your house. And that's what we're seeing here. And the UN has gone so far as to condemn this. And so the international community looks at this as another cynical ploy that, okay, Crimea was one thing with your little green men, but this is a bold and in-your-face brutal attempt to do something that will not stand. So the question remains, with Ukrainian troops on the soil of the contested territories, does an annexation make any sense? And what's going to be the ultimate outcome over the next couple of weeks is fighting continues over land that he believes cynically and is going to celebrate claiming as Russian when it clearly isn't Russian.
Let's talk about escalation for a second in this. It kind of struck me to realize this week, watching some of the reports, is that Russia at no time so far in this conflict cut off the power grid in Ukraine, or cut off their internet access, or some other vital key components and infrastructure that could have really had a bigger impact upon the greater country of Ukraine. So it seems like there's still some wiggle room here when it comes to escalation. So I guess my question to you is, can you lay out for me what a real escalation looks like here as far as the steps go? Because every time something happens, we're told we're on the verge of, it's another Cuban Missile Crisis. We're on the verge of the world destruction with nuclear weapons. So, like, where are we at, like, in the actual scale of things that can be done before we get to global thermal nuclear war?
Yeah, there are a number of graduated steps one could expect. What I see is a question of intent versus capacity. The original intent that Vladimir Putin had was to treat this as a quote unquote a special military operation. Go in, take some key infrastructure, take some key territory, topple the Ukrainian government, drive Zelensky into exile, and call victory. And that was all supposed to be done in the first 3 to 5 days. That clearly did not happen. But if you're going to do that, then you can't necessarily go after the power grid, the governmental structure, the infrastructure, the roads, the bridges, the kinds of things that you would need to run the country once you took it over. And you're not trying to go after the populace. You're trying to destroy the military and topple the government. So there were some graduated escalations early in this war based on battlefield realities. But then we get into capacity. Once Putin started going after electrical grids and infrastructure, did he have the capacity to destroy it? His precision-guided munitions are limited in number. We have this expression called magazine depth. How deep is your rack of precision-guided missiles? And they went through those fairly quickly. And so what you see are these less precise weapons that, they may have a significantly large conventional warhead, but they create a crater, 30 feet deep right next to your target, or they hit a school instead of the infrastructure targets you're going after. So this is a bit ham-fisted. What we saw in the summer as they pulled away from Kharkiv and began the attempt to take over the rest of Luhansk and Donetsk and push and take those territories is a return to World War II doctrine, where park artillery hub to hub and just devastate each town, each village, each city you want, and then walk over the rubble. Definitely a different message, definitely a different outcome. And that lasted through the end of July until the Ukrainians put the HIMARS missiles on the battlefield, started destroying the ammunition stockage that the artillery relied upon. And so you saw the rate of Russian artillery fire drop to nearly zero once that started. And then we started going after headquarters and made it difficult for senior leaders to continue to run the war because they were getting killed in large numbers. And so this back and forth sort of stutter step movement and escalation is what you've seen. Whether it's controlled or by design is difficult to say. I say no. I think that it's a bit out of control at this point.
So in your opinion, what would be next then? Like, what are those steps before a nuclear weapon might be considered on the battlefield?
Well, we've seen the sabotage of the pipelines. The next few days, you're going to see the sort of gambled consequence of annexation. Does the rhetoric resonate with the Russian people? Or does Vladimir Putin continue to hemorrhage military-age young men and reservists who are rushing over the border faster than they could be scooped up and put into the line? He's lost the equivalent of a massive army of people just fleeing the country. Armies of quote-unquote armies of Russians just abandoning Russia because they don't want to be scooped up in this draft. Can he reconstitute his military, which is what he has to do? What was sent in February of this year no longer exists. Some 50,000 dead probably, and maybe 2 or 3 times that number. So the original 160,000 that went no longer exist, to be replaced by whatever he can get in this 300,000 muster, whoever shows up and whoever they can get their hands on. Even if he's able to reconstitute an army and push it in, they're not going to be very well equipped, and they're not going to be trained at all. So it only gets worse from here conventionally.
I noticed that he was drafting these guys to start with out east in the ethnic regions, sort of giving a pass to Moscow, giving a pass to St. Petersburg, allowing those guys to hit their airports as fast as possible, buying up every single plane ticket they could find. And as you said, making the mass exodus here. And now the wives and moms of those soldiers that have been called up are protesting, and it seems protesting is on the rise too in Russia.
Yeah, he's got a real internal problem. There's also brain drain. Anybody who had the means and the capital and the intellect to get out is either out or on the way out. So what he's going to be left with will be some really hard choices. And you're absolutely right that the vast majority of the conscript soldiers and the first guys who went in, if they were not the elite of the elite, were taken from places outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg. It wasn't those Russians who were going; it was the Siberian kids, the rural kids who were going. And he's out of supply of those kids, and the population and the mothers of those kids are wondering where their kids went. So he's now lost the narrative in reality because of the casualties that he can no longer deny. Also, there's no quote unquote iron curtain of silence he can throw over social media and access to other information. The Russians are pretty good, pretty savvy about finding other alternative sources of information to actually get at the truth. And the truth of the outcome of the war so far is now undeniable.
I've been watching some Russian YouTubers just to kind of get a feel from how they're seeing things and their perspective. And at least 2 of them have fled the country at this point. I'm sure there's others. But one of the things that one of these YouTubers said that I found very fascinating was just the tolerance for protesting in Russia is far different than it is in the West. They've not really had much toleration for protesting, so Russian citizens don't really protest all that much. But this has changed all of that. They are feeling emboldened now to protest on a greater level. And yet we spoke to one of these Russian YouTubers, I don't know, was it Rudy? It's a couple months back, Konstantin.
Yeah, I want to say it's like 2 months ago.
And he's been reporting on all of this. And he said 75% of Russians were in favor or were support. And I kind of questioned him on that a little bit. And he followed up and said, no, it's true. 75% were in support. Do you have any idea? Have you heard anything from your perspective of what the level of approval is for this military action in Russia?
Well, that high level of support made a lot of sense early on for a couple of reasons. Number one, you got to give credit for Russian pride. They're incredibly proud people, and so when you couple that with a propaganda misunderstanding or deliberate cynical ploy to frame this war in terms of the great Soviet stand against Nazi Germany. In the beginning, it made a lot of sense. This looked a lot like Grandpa's war. We're protecting Mother Russia from a threat from the West. You've got Nazis in Ukraine. And there was this very, very strong belief that was the extent of it and justification for the war. But as more information has become available to the average Russian citizen about what this really was and was Russia under imminent threat, what were they doing? Were they responding to a provocation, or were they initiating a war where there was none before? Very real questions about the legitimacy of the effort are now entering the political dialogue. It's tough for us to see it because we're not listening to Russian media. We're not there, and we're not Russian. But from their perspective, it made a lot of sense for there to be a lot of support. That's diminishing rapidly now as the truth gets to more and more Russians.
Well, we're down to it. So let me ask you this last question with seconds on the clock. What about sanctions? Do you think we're going to see tougher, increased sanctions on the Russian economy?
That's certainly what the EU says. There has to be some response to the sabotage of the pipeline. There has to be some response to the attempted annexation. The question is, what is the UN going to do? What is the EU going to do? This cannot be a unilateral action of the United States. There has to be real, tough political and economic measures to put a stop to this and get the Russians to do something about what essentially is a war for the ego of one man.
Hold it. All right. Well, I guess that's it. That music means we got to go. Retired Army Colonel Matt Dooley, we're so grateful for your time today. Thank you for giving us your insight. God bless you and God love you.
God bless you. Thank you.
All right, that's going to do it for hour number 1 of Catholic Drive Time. If you can join us in the second hour, Dave Palmer is going to be our guest, host of Back to the Father. And we're going to jump into the deep and profound question, what is truth, with St. Thomas Aquinas? All that and more, plus the game show, and we're giving out prizes. Join us online at grnonline.com/CDT. Make sure to sign up for that email list. We'll see you on Monday.